The warning that could have changed everything arrived quietly, buried inside a thick folder of reports, maps, and production numbers. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't emotional, it didn't accuse anyone or demand anything. It simply laid out the truth. A truth Adolf Hitler didn't want to hear. A truth he pushed aside until it was far too late to fix. Inside the document, Germany's own military specialists explained in calm, precise language that the war the country was fighting was no longer the war the leadership imagined. It was turning into something bigger, longer, and far more unforgiving. And if Germany stayed on the same path, the outcome was already decided. The folder reached the desk of Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, a man who saw the war in a way Hitler never could. Halder lived in numbers and logistics, not dreams and ideology. He read map grids, not fantasies. And the numbers in front of him were alarming. Germany was already fighting on too many fronts. The industry was stretched, supplies were shrinking. Yet the leadership still believed the conflict would be quick and decisive. Halder knew better. He had watched the Red Army fall back, but never collapse. He had seen Soviet factories moving deeper into the interior, out of reach. He had seen German armored divisions burning through fuel faster than Germany could replace it. And he knew what was coming before anyone else dared to say it out loud. The report made one simple prediction. A long conflict against the combined strength of the Soviet Union, Britain, and eventually the United States was unwinnable. Not difficult, not unlikely. Unwinnable. Germany did not have the industry, the raw materials, or the manpower to sustain a multi-year struggle against powers with far greater reserves. If the leadership wanted victory, it had to act differently. End the Eastern Campaign quickly or prepare for a disaster. But quickly was no longer possible. The Red Army was stabilizing. Winter was approaching. Reinforcements were arriving. The window for a short campaign had closed. Halder understood all of this, and he tried to deliver the warning with urgency but without panic. A meeting was arranged. Maps were pinned to walls. Officers gathered around the long polished table. As Halder spoke, he pointed to the figures that showed Soviet production climbing and German supply lines stretching across thousands of miles. He explained that fuel stocks were dangerously low. He warned that German units were exhausted, that the weather would make the roads impassable, and that the Red Army would not simply melt away. He urged a strategic pause before winter crushed the advance. He suggested consolidating positions, protecting supply lines, and preparing for a prolonged fight that Germany could not win without major adjustments. Hitler didn't react with curiosity or concern. He reacted like someone hearing a personal insult. He waved away the data. He dismissed the numbers as overly cautious. He claimed his instincts mattered more than any report. To him, the Soviet Union was already collapsing. Victory was only one final push away. If the generals doubted this, then they lacked faith. The room went silent. Officers exchanged glances without moving their heads. Everyone sensed the moment slipping away. Halder tried again, gently mentioning the coming winter. He mentioned the effects of cold, the limits of equipment, the reality of frozen terrain. Hitler cut him off. He insisted the Red Army was finished. He insisted the Soviet leadership was on the edge. He insisted nothing, whether distance or resistance, could stop the momentum. From that moment, no one in the room believed the leadership was grounded in reality. The warning had been delivered, and it had been rejected. Halder recorded in his diary that night that Hitler had become incapable of seeing reason. But the consequences were not just internal. The refusal to listen changed the war itself. Because while Germany was charging forward, believing victory was close, the Soviet Union was preparing something else entirely. Reinforcements from the Far East, fresh divisions not yet tested, and reserve units rebuilt after the early losses were gathering beyond the horizon. As the weather shifted, the ground hardened and temperatures dropped. German vehicles froze to the earth. Engines failed, oil thickened, boots cracked, weapons jammed, yet orders still demanded advances. Soldiers were told to keep pushing even as their clothing stiffened with ice. Trains meant to deliver supplies slowed and then stalled. Horses collapsed, trucks simply refused to start. Fuel ran too low to heat shelters. But the leadership still insisted the Red Army was collapsing. The fantasy held even as the front lines stopped moving. Then came the counter-strike. A wave of Soviet units, better equipped for the cold, surged forward. German divisions that had fought for months without rest suddenly faced an enemy that was faster, fresher, and more prepared. Entire sections of the front bent under the pressure. Supply depots fell. Communications broke apart. German officers sent urgent messages for reinforcements, ammunition, fuel, anything. But nothing came. The empire that had swept across Europe in less than 2 years could no longer support itself. Back in Berlin, the leadership blamed everyone except themselves. They blamed the weather. They blamed the generals. They blamed foreign powers. But the truth had been in that forgotten folder months earlier. Germany had launched a massive campaign without understanding the limits of its own strength. It had entered a long, grinding conflict without the resources to endure it. It had ignored the warning that predicted the very disaster now unfolding. That decision didn't just cost momentum. It cost the initiative, the stability of the front, and ultimately the chance to win the conflict at all. Helder continued trying to warn the leadership, but each attempt made things worse. Anyone who questioned the optimistic reports was pushed aside. Anyone who mentioned the painful realities of supply shortages found themselves labeled defeatists. Over time, Hitler took full control of operational decisions. Generals were no longer allowed to retreat even when holding a position meant losing entire divisions. Orders became emotional instead of strategic. Commanders were punished for accuracy and rewarded for promises. The leadership believed determination alone could force success. But determination doesn't move fuel. Determination doesn't fix engines in minus temperatures. Determination doesn't replace thousands of lost vehicles or rest exhausted units. Determination doesn't replace the factories Germany lacked. The ignored warning grew louder and more obvious with every month. As the Soviet Union rebuilt, reorganized, and expanded its industrial capacity, Germany reached the opposite direction. Factories were bombed, resources were limited, imports vanished. The Eastern Front became a bottomless drain, consuming men and equipment faster than Germany could replenish them. Every attempt to regain the initiative resulted in deeper losses. Each offensive shrank in scale and ambition. And all the while, Hitler insisted everything was fine. The original mistake had multiplied into a dozen more. By the time the leadership realized how severe the situation truly was, the balance of power had shifted permanently. The Soviet Union was outproducing Germany several times over. The United States had entered the conflict, bringing enormous industrial weight. Britain continued resisting with full force. The alliance forming against Germany was too vast to counter. And all the predictions Halder and other officers had made became reality one by one. Inside the rank and file, soldiers began to feel something they had never felt in the early campaigns. The sense that the leadership didn't understand the conditions on the ground. They were told victory was near even as they fought in worsening circumstances. They were told the enemy was collapsing even as Soviet artillery shook the earth and pushed them backward. They were told reinforcements were coming even when battalions were left alone for days. The disconnect grew until morale cracked. Letters home spoke of exhaustion, of fear, of confusion about why the leadership refused to see what every man in the trenches saw clearly. Halder himself eventually paid the price. His attempts to warn the leadership were taken as criticism, and he was removed from his position. The one person who had tried hardest to prevent the coming disaster was pushed aside just as his predictions were being proven correct. After his removal, the leadership no longer heard even the faintest echo of reality. The decisions became riskier, the expectations higher, and the consequences greater. The leadership demanded victories that were physically impossible. They ordered units to stand ground even when outnumbered and undersupplied. They insisted on holding territory instead of maneuvering. And slowly the front collapsed. Looking back, historians often describe the moment the warning was ignored as the moment Germany lost the war, even though the conflict continued for years. Because strategy is not just about battles, it is about understanding limitations. As the leadership believed confidence could compensate for shortages. They believed optimism could replace fuel. They believed instinct could overpower mathematics. But the map doesn't bend for belief, and the Soviet factories didn't slow because someone wished they would. Reality does not change to accommodate a leader's imagination. The most striking part of this story is that the warning wasn't from an enemy, it wasn't from foreign observers, it wasn't from spies or diplomats. It came from Germany's own specialists, men who dedicated their careers to understanding war. They weren't trying to undermine anything. They were trying to prevent the disaster that eventually arrived. They wanted a strategy that matched the conditions. They wanted to avoid overextension. They wanted to protect the army from a fight it could not win. And for delivering that truth, they were dismissed. In the end, the warning became a symbol of something larger. The dangers of a leader who refuses to hear anything that contradicts his beliefs. The refusal to listen didn't just lose a battle, it set in motion a chain reaction. From the first winter on the Eastern Front to the massive losses that followed, every stage of the collapse traced back to that moment when the truth was placed on a desk and rejected. The tragedy of the situation is how preventable much of it was. A pause before winter could have saved equipment and preserved strength. A realistic assessment of the Soviet Union could have avoided overconfidence. A more flexible approach could have allowed retreats when necessary. But none of it was possible once the leadership had convinced itself that all warnings were lies and all discomfort was weakness. Once that mindset took over, the war stopped being a contest of strategy and became a race towards self-inflicted disaster. When historians examine the downfall, they often return to that single report. Not because it contained prophecy, but because it contained truth. A truth that could have redirected the conflict before the point of no return. A truth delivered at precisely the moment it was needed. A truth ignored until the consequences became too large to escape. This is why the warning stands out. It was the last chance for Germany to recognize the scale of the fight it had entered. The last chance to prepare for a long struggle instead of assuming a short victory. The last chance to adjust strategy before the Eastern Front consumed everything. But it was brushed aside, dismissed as negativity, and forgotten. And from that moment, the outcome of the conflict became something no amount of determination or belief could change.